week, doesn't matter.
Okay. Hey, Yochanan, Noah, welcome. So,
Good evening.
tonight's discussion. Good evening. Good evening. Welcome. Tonight we're going to discuss the concept of rebuke and embarrassment. Embarrassing another person, rebuke. Are these things ever okay? Is it ever okay to rebuke somebody? If yes, when? What does the Torah say about all this? That's the question. What does the Torah have to say about this topic? I don't think this is something that's very commonly discussed. It's not your typical discussion point that you would enter into when you're having some type of share. But I do think that it's an important discussion, as we're going to see, a very, very important discussion. So I wanted to start off with a little bit of a question for you, is when you hear of the word rebuke, it doesn't sound like a fun word to me. But what do you think of the word rebuke? What does it kind of bring up in your mind?
I'm happy to, whoops, microphone there. I'm happy to start because, yeah, got no embarrassment. Let's see. So rebuke. Well, it's a word that we don't use in normal daily language anyway. It's like an older, more formal English word. Right. But it's, to me, it's to tell someone off, but not really sharply or lengthily. It's like a quick response. It's a quick telling off.
Is there, so you saying it's not a word that we usually use, it's usually the word we would use would be criticism.
Or, you know, or just tell someone that they're wrong.
Criticism and rebuke?
I think so. I think there is a difference.
Okay, so why is it a word that we don't use today? And that's what I started off by saying. It's not something that you typically hear as a topic.
Yeah, that's right. I was going to say because it's hard to spell, but criticism is longer.
It's politically incorrect to tell anybody that they're wrong.
So here's the thing. Criticism, and this is, I suppose, perhaps the difference. Criticism is more politically correct because criticize, you could say, well, I don't like the way you're doing something, whatever it is. So that could be your own personal flavor or whatever it is, or telling someone that they did something that you don't like. You're criticizing their behavior, whatever it may be. Rebuke is telling something off and almost saying that what they're doing is wrong. And as in, you know what is right, and you're telling them that they are wrong. That's a rebuke. So that's perhaps a slight, and as Fritz perfectly spelled out very clearly, today it's politically correct to tell anybody that they're wrong, because who are you to say that somebody else is wrong, which means to say that you know the truth and that you know that something's right, which is of course a major facet in today's world. Nobody wants to be told what is wrong and what is right. You know, there's this kind of theory out there that that right and wrong is subjective. It's like, you know, if I decide that I want that today, I want to be a lollipop, and you think that that's just wrong for human beings to decide that they're lollipops or whatever, or to act like a cat or to act like a child, just because you decided that it's wrong, that who says that it is wrong? I want to do that. Why should I not be allowed to do that? Or that's your opinion, this is my opinion, leave me alone. It's this type of ideal that we leave you alone. So that's the issue that we face. As in, it's not an issue, that's the status, that's the way the world is. Is it good or bad? It's a bit of both. So here's where I want to take this. The truth is that I think that a rebuke is the ability to guide people in the right direction. And we don't like to use the word rebuke because perhaps rebuke is not something that we're doing. When we say rebuke, it comes of saying, you're wrong, I'm right, this is what has to be done, or you just you know, that behavior is bad. So instead, we try to color things up a bit and try to be more politically correct, and we don't say that you're wrong and I'm bad and you're bad or things like that. We try to say things like, oh, I wouldn't recommend that type of behavior, you know, it's not necessarily so healthy for you. And we always try to conjure up some type of way of saying it that wouldn't be so politically incorrect. So we're always trying to find the right words for it, which is fine. So you won't hear, you know, the latest book, How to Rebuke Your Friend in a Good Way. It'll be how to discipline your children without, you know, without ruining your relationships, which is, to be honest, it's the same concept. But the Torah talks specifically about the concept of rebuke. So the Torah actually has a commandment that talks on the concept of rebuke, and says not only that we are that there is this concept of rebuke, but it tells us that we're obligated to rebuke. When you see somebody doing something wrong, you are obligated to tell them off. Now, in a society that we live in, where everybody has a different opinion about what's right and what's wrong, I don't really want the person down the road telling me what's wrong and what's right. You know, that fact that that I put my kids to get bed at 7 o'clock, and then on Pesach night was walking down the street at midnight with them after the Seder. I don't really want anybody telling me that I'm wrong, because it's not their business. Okay, fine. But and that's, I suppose, the healthy side of it. But the Torah says that we as people are obligated to look out for another. And it goes so far as to say that not only can you rebuke, but you're obligated to rebuke. And not only are you obligated to rebuke, but if you don't rebuke when you have the ability, then you are transgressing. Not only you, to a certain degree, could be on the level of a murderer. Now, that's a harsh statement. Now, how can I say that someone that doesn't rebuke, when the rebuking is probably one of the most frowned upon things that we'll have in our society? And then I'm coming with saying that if you don't rebuke, you're a murderer. Now, I'm not saying that anyone's murderers. I'm not saying, because we all are guilty of not rebuking. It's not something that we do today. It's just not, it's not common practice. Unless you're the old man sitting at the back of the shul, then it's your job to rebuke. But everybody else is not allowed to rebuke. That's the way society is today. So before I explain to you that statement, the controversial statement of the rabbis, that anybody that doesn't rebuke could be as though he has spilled blood, I want to tell you that there's actually certain conditions to the concept of rebuke. So the Torah says rebuke. Let me first start off with showing you the psukim, because when you see where the concept of rebuke falls in the Torah, it sheds a lot of light. I've touched upon this in certain shiurim, but when I did in other shiurim in the past, I had a totally different focus. Today, my focus is going to be on the two elements of rebuke and embarrassment, which is what we really want to talk about. Because on the one hand, we want to help the person. You have to understand what's the goal of rebuke. The goal of rebuke is to help the person. And 95% of the time, the reason why rebuke is so frowned upon is because our egos today is so high. We have such strong egos that when anybody tells us the slightest bit of rebuke or decides something, we're like, who you, and we can't handle it. We get all flat. So on the other hand, there's also another concept of embarrassing people. Even if you are right and the person's not so egotistic, it has to be done in the right way. So let's look at some of the sources when we talk about this. Let's look at this. I'm trying to see if I could just share my screen. Okay, so look over here for a moment if you don't mind. Look at the screen. Just moving things around. Okay, let's make this a drop bigger. No, that's too big. Okay. Look at verse 17. Look what it says first. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. Part of the concept of rebuking is not to hate. So that's an interesting point, right? What does it tell us? It first tells us don't hate your brother. By the way, what's also important is the previous verse. All these verses are fundamental. You shall not go around as a gossip monger amongst your people. So if you got to rebuke somebody, it's rebuking. Just understand, you can't go telling other people about it. You got that job, you have to tell somebody else. If you see somebody doing wrong, you're telling them wrong, and that's it. You shall not stand by the shedding of your fellow's blood. I am Hashem your Lord. Okay, so this is what I spoke to you about a moment ago about murder. We'll get back to that. The shedding of your brother's blood. And let's first look at the actual verse, and then I'll go back to verse 16, then we'll go up to verse 18, and we'll see how all these neighboring verses play an important role in how we're going to understand this concept. So look, it says you shall not go around as a gossiper amongst your people. Okay, so don't tell other people your issues that you have with somebody else. 17, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. Condition number one, there's three major conditions to rebuking, to tell us, to do criticism, to anything that you want to tell somebody else. You want to tell somebody off, you have to have three conditions. Number one, you can't have any hate. If you harbor any hate to that person, you just ain't going to fit the cap. You can't do it. Next is you shall surely rebuke your fellow. But look at this. It says you shall surely rebuke your fellow. That's the mitzvah. Hocheach tochiach et amisecha. You shall surely rebuke your fellow. And then it says, v'lo tisa alav chet. And you shall not bear a sin on his account. Now, if we were to look at the Rashi on Chabad.org, looks like I'm doing great cool stuff, but Chabad.org gives you that ability to play around with it. Let's look at the Rashi on the words lo tisa alav chet. Do not bear a sin on his account. But you shall not bear a sin. It looks at you should, but what does it say? In the course of rebuking a fellow, do not embarrass him in public. It teaches us really important. If you want to rebuke somebody, if you see doing something wrong, you're obligated to rebuke them. But condition number one is you can't hate them. That's what we learn. Condition number two is you can't do it in a way that's going to embarrass them. Lo tisa alav chet, says Rashi. Got it? Now, what's the next verse say? Lo tikom, do not take revenge. If it's in any way you hold any sort of grudge, right? And sitor is a grudge, revenge is sikom, et b'nei amecha. Now, what does it say? V'yahavta l'reacha kamocha. You shall love your fellow as yourself. Ani Hashem. I'm Hashem, I know. So what's the saying? What it's saying is that if you want to rebuke somebody, there's going to be four major qualifications for it. Number one, you have to make sure that you have absolutely no hatred towards that person. Number two is that when you do it, you have to make sure that there's going to be absolutely no embarrassment. So part and parcel of this mitzvah is this one pasuk teaches us three things. It teaches us, number one, how to rebuke. Number two is which person is allowed to rebuke. Some it doesn't hate, and some it doesn't embarrass. And then the next pasuk teaches us that if you're having any type of way to get revenge or a grudge, then it's once again, it's part of hate. It doesn't work. And number three is v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. It has to be coming from love. If you don't have a feeling of love, that you're actually caring for that person as you'd care for yourself, and you're getting any pleasure or any type of gratification out of actually telling your fellow off, then you are in the wrong boat. So the reason why we don't rebuke today is, I think, more than anything, because we can't fit these categories. When we see somebody doing something wrong, it's very difficult to us to say that I love them as I love myself. Number two, to say that I have no hatred towards them or no grudge against them, that's another reason why you wouldn't do it. And that you're going to be so careful not to embarrass them in public. So that's the most important concepts to know.
Can I ask a question or shall I wait?
You can take a question. I just wanted to introduce the psukim. I wanted to say one more point, and then you could ask a question. Just, of course, this is when you say the word v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your fellow as yourself. You can't skip what Rashi brings from Rabbi Akiva. And Amar Rabbi Akiva is a klal gadol b'Torah. Rabbi Akiva, one of the greatest rabbis in history, said that this verse of loving your fellow as yourself is the great principle of the entire Torah. Okay, go ahead, ask your question.
Let's say you're in shul and somebody is talking loudly in front of children. So he gives a very bad example. You walk up to the person and say, would you please be quiet? You disturb the people around you. And you go and sit down. And 2 minutes later, he's still talking loudly. And you ask him, please be quiet. You're disturbing other people. The third time you have to go to the person, you say, please be quiet. It's upsetting. If you want to talk, go outside. If you want to pray, stay inside. And he still keeps talking, ignoring you, because his ego is so big that he wants to be heard and seen. And you tell him loud and clear, you're disturbing, you give a bad example to children behind you, in front of you, and you get angry and you make a scene because he is causing embarrassment to the person who asked him to be quiet and keep decorum. So he doesn't feel the embarrassment, but the person who tries to do the right thing feels embarrassed. How do you deal with somebody who is ignoring other people in shul during the service, reading the Torah, and doesn't give a hoot about anybody else?
All right. You brought up I'm glad you brought up this question. So I'm going to ask you to repeat the question later on, because I'm hoping that I'll give some guidelines throughout this discussion, and let's revisit that case, and that's going to be our case study for tonight. That's our typical Jewish community case study. Hopefully we all go to shul once in a while, and if we don't, we should. And there's always those annoying people that talk. Hopefully it's not the rabbi. Sometimes it is the rabbi. Usually it is also the rabbi. But anyway, the rabbis at least have a good excuse. They have to be kind. They have to welcome everybody. Everybody else can keep their mouth shtum. But whatever the case is. Okay, so let's keep your example. That's going to be a case study. And Fritz, I'm going to give you a job to help us revisit that case afterwards and see how much of that particular case we've answered, because I think that's a really important a very important type of general case of to see what should I be doing in that type of case. This is normal run-of-the-mill stuff. Somebody's annoying, somebody's getting on your nerves, or somebody's disturbing, somebody's doing something wrong, and they're not listening, and they continue to do it. What should you do? So let's see how we answer that, and let's see if we can come up with a little bit of a clarification ourselves. So let's first I want to focus on one other point before I answer, before we go on tonight's discussion, and that is this concept of the embarrassment. It's really, really important to be very careful about embarrassment. And we don't even understand how much we have to be careful. So if you're not 100% sure that you might not embarrass the person, I would say it's best not to rebuke. So this could cancel out almost all practical, quick, be quiet, you're disturbing shul type of discussions. It could or could not. Do you have the time or the patience to then go up to each person that's talking and say, you know, you got to pull them aside and say, listen, it's not okay. It's disturbing. But when you say that you have to be super careful not to embarrass the person, that changes the whole picture. Because in the very same verse where the Torah commands you to rebuke, over there it's also telling you that if the person causes you to have a grudge against them, let's say they don't listen, then don't rebuke them. It's also telling you that you have to be extremely careful about embarrassing them. So if you're not certain that what you're doing is going to embarrass, then not only are you not that it's not suggested, you're not allowed to. So much so, the Torah tells us that somebody that embarrasses somebody else loses their portion in the world to come. So the reason for this is that we know that there's 3 cardinal sins, right? 3 sins that you should rather transgress the sin than, you should rather be killed than transgress the sin. All the other Torah, you should rather transgress the sin and not be killed. What are those? Killing somebody else, immorality, promiscuous relationships, or idolatry. So if you face with one of those 3 options, you should rather die than commit the sin. But when it comes to anything else, you should rather do the sin. So the Torah tells us that embarrassing another person is to the same equivalent as murder. That when you embarrass somebody else in public, they lose all their blood. You know the way a person, it says, Lo yisa moed al dam riecha, don't, the pasuk, the previous person says, don't stand on the blood of your fellow. And it applies to these 2 parts of the pasuk. The one part of the pasuk told us, the previous pasuk, right? I'm going to share my screen with you again so you understand what I'm talking about. In verse 16, it said, Lo tamod al dam reyecha, don't stand by the shedding of your brother's feather. Tell us the basic understanding if you see that he's drowning or something like that. But Lo tadam al dam reyecha also comes the previous verse before this. Now this verse tells us not to rebuke, not to hate, not to rebuke, and not to embarrass. So it tells us like this. When you cause a person to be embarrassed, it's like spilling their blood. And one of the great commentators gave an example. He says, you know what happens when a person goes embarrassed? They go red because their face gets filled with blood. And then what happens? They go white. And that white is like you're spilling their blood. And one of the most longest lasting pains that a person can suffer is the pain of embarrassment. It's something that can stay with a person for much longer than a cut or any other physical injury. The pain of embarrassment. So it's considered to a certain degree the pain of murder. The second thing is, I said to you before that not only are we obligated, not only can we rebuke, but we're obligated to rebuke, but if you don't rebuke, it's like murder. right? Why? Because it says over here, "Lo yisal moed al dam re'echo." What does that mean? If you see somebody is drowning in the sea, according to civil law in Australia, if you drive past somebody that was just in a car accident and you could do CPR treatment to help them and you don't, are you guilty? No, nothing can happen to you. If you see somebody drowning in the sea and you walk away, are you guilty? No. According to Torah law, you are. Because of this verse, Lo yisal moed al dam re'echo. You're obligated to help somebody if you have the ability. If you see somebody dying, you're obligated to help, because the Torah, it's a discussion for another time. The Torah is not about rights, it's about responsibility. What are you responsible to do? This is your responsibility. Now, the same thing over here is if you see somebody that is sinning, that's doing something wrong, and you don't tell them off and tell them what's the right path, now that's within the qualifications that you said, that you're able to do it without any hatred, without embarrassment, and with love. And we'll talk about that in a moment. And you have not fulfilled that, then it's as though you have murdered them. Why? Because their soul, their spiritual life is dying when a person does a sin. And if you're obligated to save a person physically, which is a temporary life, how much more so you're obligated to save them spiritually when you see them doing something wrong, which is an eternal life. Okay? So lo yisal moed al dam re'echo, that's the concept of not spilling your blood on your friend. So we see that this concept of the basic understanding, when you see somebody drowning, see somebody dying, you're obligated to save them. It doesn't just mean physically, it means simply don't cause them embarrassment. And not only that, don't stand by when another person is doing wrong things and you have the ability to help them. But we haven't finished the qualifications of what it means to rebuke somebody, according to Torah. Yeah.
So
Okay, go ahead.
On the one hand, you say if somebody does wrong, you have to save them from embarrassment doing something wrong, but you can't tell them because you embarrass them. So in both cases, the sinner is protected here. The consequences for the people around him, for example, a bad example for children, or disturbance of praying to God, they interrupt the conversation from people to God, that's okay. Never mind the people who suffer because of this person. We are talking here about the sinner.
Okay, so I haven't finished the qualifications, so that we're going to get into more details. And when somebody's doing something wrong in public, the situation can differ. Okay, so the situation can be different when somebody's making a public problem, public issues. But I never get let the sinner off the hook. Don't forget, the concept of rebuke is not for anybody else's benefit other than the main benefit that you want to give is to the person that is actually doing the thing. So if your goal is of course, in the cases you're talking about with the shul case, you're trying to get decorum in the shul. So what you care about is not about the person talking. You care about the people that are hearing it and have to try to concentrate on the davening, correct?
Both.
Both. But in the case, or you're caring about the children. But in the case of in the Torah's commandment, it's about the person that's doing the sin. You don't care about anybody else, really. The focus is on the person that's doing it. Okay? So that's why it could be different when a person is doing harm to themselves or harm to others. It could be different. But often if you're going to be harming yourself, you'll also be harming others as well in the process. You always are, even though secular society does not always acknowledge that. At least secular law does not always acknowledge that. That sometimes when you're hurting somebody else, you're actually when you're hurting yourself, you're actually hurting other people around you. We know nobody lives in a bubble. We all live in a world, and I'll talk about it more as we go on. I'm not going to fully get to your case just yet, because I've answered too much of what I'm going to say, Fritz, and that's why I'm holding you up. But as you've opened us, we've noticed that it's a different situation, because we're talking about how it's disturbing other people in public, and how there could be so many more ideas to it, and what halacha says about that. Yeah, go on, Joe.
Yeah, a quick question in the same vein about Chabad. Will approach people on the street and ask if they've put on tefillin today, and I wanted to posit that how that activity fits in with this halacha, with these requirements, because it's potentially embarrassing to confront people about that.
That's another interesting one. Okay, that I don't have as a clear case study for. It's not as clear of a case study for like Fritz's case, because that's, I suppose, a very technical concept. Whether we say, will people be embarrassed or not? There's another famous concept, which is the very beginning of Shulchan Aruch says, "Al tispayish mipnei maligim." Do not be embarrassed from those that laugh. And there's one thing to say, if a person goes up to you in the middle of the of shul and says, "Listen, I'm going to make a big announcement. This man hasn't put on tefillin today," 100% that is certainly as embarrassing as it gets. But if a person comes up to you and says, "Listen, I've got an opportunity for you to be connected to Hashem. You may not have understood this or decided to take that upon yourself. And I want to ask you, have you taken that opportunity today to do that, to be connected to the Almighty, infinite creator of heaven and earth today, and the most powerful acquisition that you can do today? Have you done that?" Well, I understand embarrassment is subjective, and therefore you would hope that people do it in a polite and meaningful and a non-embarrassing, what's the right word, too intruding type of manner. But at the end of the day, Eila Dover safe. There's no end to the matter. If a person can easily say, "Yes, I have," if they feel embarrassed, and then they've gotten over that. Many people do that, and that's understood. They're embarrassed, whether they're embarrassed to admit that they haven't put on tefillin, and that's good. And you know what? People should be embarrassed that they haven't put on tefillin. Present company included, excluded, however you want to put that. Tefillin is a mitzvah that we should be doing. We'll talk about what happens about people that aren't brought up with it, and how does this whole mitzvah fall into that category. It's another discussion, but it is part of tonight's discussion. What happens if somebody wasn't brought up in a particular way? Do you still have the obligation? What happens if you see somebody driving to shul and the Torah says you're not allowed to? Is it your obligation to say, "Hey, do you know that you're not allowed to drive to shul?" Well, that would include probably about 90% of the Jewish world today. How would you handle that? It's a different. Each case is different.
I'm happy to share on the group here why I asked the question. Once, many years ago, I had this situation myself where a rabbi came up to me and just straight out challenged, "Have you put on tefillin today?" Now, in the past, I've been through many of those scenarios. Certainly don't want to lie. If I hadn't yet, I don't want to say no, I haven't. I don't want to lie and say yes, I have when I hadn't. So instead, I turned it around. This is what actually happened, and I won't reveal who or where. But when they asked me, "Have you put on tefillin today?" instead of answering that question, I said, "Have you changed your underwear today?" And they looked quite surprised. And I said, "Well, they're both personal questions."
Okay. I like the response. I would have been quite embarrassed by that type of response, because I don't know if I'm just kidding. Thank God I change my underwear every day. I can say no. Well, I suppose there you go. That's the answer. Just like you have the I don't know. I don't know how personal it is whether you put on tefillin or not. But I suppose you can say, we'll leave that discussion for a moment. Okay, I'll hopefully get back to those discussions at the end. Okay, let's just try to get a little bit more groundwork, because it's really important to understand this idea of the embarrassment issue when it comes to rebuke. Okay, this is a fundamental concept. It's right there in the pasuk. The verse itself states about embarrassing. Now, in the Talmud, it gives two reasons why the second temple were destroyed. One reason given is that the reason why the temple was destroyed was because there was a man by the name of Bar Kamta who was invited to a party instead of somebody else with a very similar name to him, and he was chased out, and there was other rabbis and prestigious Jews in the room, in the house, and he was chased out, and he was embarrassed, and he went to Rome, and he said, the Jews are rebelling. So why did it happen? Because if somebody was embarrassed in public and then nobody stood up for that person, that's why the temple was destroyed. Another reason given, another tractate, one is given in Tractate Gideon, the other one is Tractate, sorry, I may be confusing this. One reason is given in Tractate Shabbos, is that the Jewish people at the time stopped rebuking each other. They were too embarrassed. They were too, they didn't care enough. One is Gittin and Shabbos. In Shabbos, it says that when people saw each other doing sins, they never told each other off. So that's why the temple was destroyed. There was no one there helping the people, guiding the people, criticizing the people as is required. So those are the two reasons given. Both of us are the same pasuk, whether it's because you embarrass people or for the opposite, that you're so worried to embarrass that you don't rebuke at all. The point is that we have to find the correct, not balance, but the correct way to rebuke. In other words, rebuke remains a perfect thing to do. If you cannot, so let me qualify what I'm saying. If you see somebody doing something wrong, if we're going to talk about exceptions, but under normal circumstances, if you have a child, a sibling, a friend doing something wrong, you're obligated to tell them to change their ways and tell them that they're doing wrong. Why? Because that's your obligation. Otherwise, you, to a certain degree, it's almost as though you're committing murder. However, when you do it, you have to be making sure that you're not embarrassing them. You have no grudge or hatred against them. And number three is that you have a feeling of love towards them. And number four, that you're not causing an embarrassment. So it's not that, well, oh, there's those circumstances almost never there, so therefore you don't have to rebuke. No, the rebuking is still there. It's just that because rebuking can be so harmful, you just got to be so careful and learn how to do it properly. It's like, if a person, there's two parts to a rebuke. There's two reasons why you would rebuke somebody. The one reason why you rebuke somebody is because they're doing something wrong according to the Torah. The Torah says this is the law, this is what you have to do, and you see somebody doing wrong, it says, hey, by the way, this is the law, you should be doing differently. That's one way of rebuking. It's not shouting that, telling them off, it's telling them the right way and what they've done wrong. The other way is when somebody's hurt you and you want to tell them that they hurt you. Now, we know of a huge percentage of the population, of the world population, that have been hurt for somebody else. And for whatever reason, they decide not to say anything about it. And as a result, they carry a grudge with them against that person that has like compound interest on it. It keeps on growing and growing and growing, and they never deal with it. And sometimes all they have to do is go up to that person and say, hey, by the way, you hurt my feelings. This is what happened. You hurt my feelings. And half the time the people don't even know. I've had that happen to me. I once hurt somebody, the person didn't talk to me for a few days. And And I was like, so what's going on? I sent them a message, and thank God the person said, listen, you hurt my feelings, you upset me. If you don't do that, and then I was able to clarify that, that I totally misunderstood and never meant to hurt them. But if you're just going to shut down, then, and you don't go and rebuke the person, tell them, then it will just be a misunderstanding, and you could sever good relationships and harbor deep resentment for no good reason whatsoever. So that's the first reason why it's really important when it's something personal. But the same thing is with practical law. If you don't tell the people off, they're going to just go further and further down the wrong path, and they'll never learn the right way to go. And if you don't help them to become better people, then who is going to help them? And it's, so that's our obligation as people, to help people improve. So here's the thing. As I mentioned, we're obligated to tell people off when we have that opportunity. But there's a few qualifications, like we've said. But first of all, to remember like this. When you see somebody doing something wrong, the first thing you have to think to yourself is, do I ever do that thing myself? Am I guilty of doing that thing myself? And first, before you go and tell that person off, let's say you see somebody, let's just say for argument's sake, you see somebody talking in shul. You have to stop first and say, do I ever talk in shul when it's not appropriate? Now, it could be I do it in a whisper, in a much slower tone. And before I tell them off, I have to find it within myself and make sure, hey, look who's talking, Don't let them, if they could say, look who's talking, then that's a problem. So with everything that you're telling somebody else off, always make sure that you first found it within yourself, the issue. And if you haven't, and you really think you're clear of it, then with the right way, you can do it. How do you do it? Now, if you look into today's psychology, there's great books like, 7 Steps to a Great Marriage, John Gottman, and all these other great famous psychologists out there about how to rebuke and what happens if you're having issues with your wife. Everyone will agree, if spouses are having marital issues, the right thing to do is not to just leave it behind and forget about it. Now, for some people that may work, but most people, it bottles up and can cause an explosion and causes people to become unhappy. Just to pretend it doesn't exist is not a happy thing. So what do? How do you talk about it without hurting your person? First of all, what you got to do is you have to talk in the tone, the right tone. First of all, find the perspective of love. And they say, first find something that you can praise somebody about, first something positive about it. And say, for example, let's say you want to tell your wife off because you don't like the way they cook the chicken at home. Of course, we're talking about vegan chicken. So if you don't like the way they cook your chicken at home and they just cook that rooster wrong, you want them to do it in a different way. You want to say, listen, you're an incredible cook. I really love the way you make the potatoes and the sweet potatoes, just super delicious. The salad's delicious. The chicken, if you can do it in a different way, that would be preferable. The same thing is with every type of rebuke. Just like it is in marriage, you don't want to destroy your relationship by constantly telling your spouse off, and then people are okay to accept it. Because what do you first show them love. You first show them that you're not here to destroy them. You're here to build them. You're here to help them. Find something positive to say. In other words, do it in a nice tone. Find something good. If you're not in a position to say something positive about that person, then you're possibly not in a position to be telling that person off, because then you're missing the quality of V'ahavta Re'acha Kamocha. And I'll talk to you about where it's most important is in marriage, because in day-to-day life we can rebuke our spouses. We have and in parenting, we have on a day-to-day basis the ability to tell our children off. And ideally, when we're telling them off, we're doing it in a way that they feel the love. If they feel any hatred, then rebuke will go straight over. So when rebuke doesn't work, it's usually because of a few reasons. Because there's some feeling of putting down, and you're putting me down, you're attacking the person. Or there's no feeling of love. or there could be a feeling of being embarrassed. And when a person is embarrassed, they put up all the defenses. That's the brilliance of when you think about it, you stop, you think about it. What do you see? A basic Torah written 3,333 years ago fully understands all that modern psychology teaches us about if you want to help people be successful in the way you tell somebody else and you help people improve. It's right there in the Torah. It's no great, it's no hidden secret that we think that we discovered in today's modern society. The Torah tells us, make sure that you're not embarrassing them, make sure you have no hate, and make sure that they could feel the love. The love means that they could feel that you're only doing this for their betterment. Those are the qualifications of a grid. So you're doing it in a nice, respectful moment. The Torah tells us, if you want, what happens if you see your teacher or your parent doing something wrong? And you know that what they're doing is wrong. So if you're going to come tell them you're doing wrong, you should do it in the most respectful way, saying, hey, didn't you teach us, didn't you just teach us that we're not supposed to eat that way, or that you're not supposed to do this? And when they hear that, they say, you didn't attack them. You said you were the one that taught us, and therefore they are responding in the right way. Now, I want to say, Fritz, you're on silent, but I'll just give me a moment. I want to say that taking Fritz's case of the shul, which is a different case for what we're discussing to a certain degree, but it does always, each case helps us in understanding. If you were to use those three qualifications, where you're truly showing love, you're making sure you're not embarrassing that person, and you have no grudge against them whatsoever, then 95% of the time, the rebuke will work. It will be well accepted, because they won't even realize that they rebuked them. They'll think that you lifted them up and that you praise them and that you just show them with love. And they'll be able to change the way. They'll see it as that. And that's the ideal type of rebuke that you want. Now, we're not always all capable, but that's what the Torah is trying to teach us to do. Now, what happens if you rebuke somebody and they don't listen? The Torah tells us this. Now, I would say refer back to what we just discussed, because it could be that you were missing some of those previous ingredients, and that's why the rebuke didn't listen. If they're ignoring you and you make them angry, or you're becoming angry, we actually have to stop, because you're causing more sin by your rebuke. It's not helping. It says, what is it? We take back to the screen. What does it say? But you shall not bear a sin on his account. Now, I spoke about the embarrassment, do not embarrass. But there's numerous meanings to not bearing the sin on his account. Lo yisrael chait could also mean don't cause yourself to sin, because you're going to get angry at that person. Anger itself is a sin. Did you know that? If that person doesn't listen to you and you get angry as a result, you're thereby also causing a sin to happen. Or you sometimes it's best not to even tell the person off if you know that they're not going to listen. So in other words, when you see that the person when can you rebuke the person? Only if you know that it's very likely the person is actually going to listen to you. But if you're not so sure about it, then it's better not to. And get in position, but you still have the obligation to rebuke. So then you've got to work on yourself to have the love and no hatred and no embarrassment again. So all those things will always apply. So here's the thing. The Torah gives us different qualifications of when you're obligated to rebuke. You're obligated to rebuke if it's a biblical commandment, Torah commandment, then you should rebuke them if you're not sure. But if they don't listen, then stop. If it's not a biblical commandment, let's say it's a rabbinic commandment or just something that you believe is wrong but not clearly stated, then it's best not to rebuke at all. Especially if it's in public. Now, what happens if it's something that is a biblical commandment that they're transgressing and it's in public? that they're doing it, then you give it a try, and it's best to find ways. Now, let me just give you an example of, we have to be so careful about never embarrassing. The best way to find someone, you see someone doing something wrong, if there's other people who are telling around, the 95%, 99.9% of the time, it's not the best if other people are going to hear you telling somebody off. Now, you could still be embarrassing people even if you do it in private, even if it's just you and the other person. They could still embarrass the other person. But the chance of embarrassment is much higher if it's in public, in front of at least one other person. And therefore, it's almost always not a good idea to tell people off with other people around.
Can I just interrupt you, because there's a really strong urge to ask you. I've been in both situations that I ask people to be quiet. Afterwards, they thank me, yeah, right, and they have improved their life. They're not talking in shul. Other occasions, I've told people off very clearly to be noticed by other people. So I became the sinner because they ignored me. Now, could you say, or should you say, you offer your own benefit of not being a sinner for the benefit of all the people around the one who keeps talking? Because when I walked back to my seat, people said, thank you. I didn't want to get up, but thank you for doing it for me. So there was an obvious need to try to make people sit down and be quiet and not disturb other people.
Okay, so I would say that look, we're going to keep on going back to the example that you gave of the rebuking. We've almost got enough information to answer your question. Not exactly enough, but I'll say, because I see that it's pressing and we're really running out of time. I always over prepare, I suppose. But I'll talk about it for a moment. I don't believe that it's generally the best thing, if you can, if you see people talking in shul. I think just to go shh, shh, I think that's the most that should be done. I don't think actually going and talking to people is the best way to be doing it, because people can get a hint. And if they're not going to be quiet when it's shh, shh, then it's probably best left. Now, if they're still not quiet, I would personally leave it. And if it's really a bother, I would wait till after shul and privately call the person over and say, listen, I understand that you have friends to talk to and you really want to talk, but I just want you to know that it's really bothering me, and some other people. Can I just ask you, we love you coming to shul, but please, if there's a way that in the future you don't talk, it would be greatly appreciated. And make sure that nobody else hears it, and it's really private and done in a beautiful way. That way, and that's the best that you can do. If the person doesn't listen, then you've done your job, and that's leave it. Because the side effect is, what happens if that person gets embarrassed by the fact that you said to be quiet, and that was, the person whose only connection to Judaism was that they would come to shul once a week to catch up with their friends and stay a little bit in touch with Judaism and say Shema and do a little bit of davening, and they also liked the social aspect. At the same time, they were disturbing people. But now they've decided, you know what, I don't feel comfortable, I'm embarrassed in shul, and I'm not going to go back to shul anymore. And I know many people like this. And as a result, not only that they don't have any connection, neither do their children or their grandkids have any connection to shul.
Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's a good thing, because all the other people around them will have a connection to shul, and sincere connection where they can pray.
No, I disagree.
And if you go by the majority, who benefits more, the sinner or the victims? Then the sinner will be. So the sinner is the one you defend, and the people who are disadvantaged, they should suffer.
No, as I said, I think that we have to understand who we're dealing with and what we're dealing with in today's society. I get your feeling, and many people have your feeling, and it's really annoying to go to a show where people talk. And I think that something should be done about it, and I'm very clear about it. If it's something that bothers, there's some shuls that they don't mind it, and okay, so be it for them. Whether it's right or wrong, of course, the ideal way is there's no talking shul and everyone comes and for the full duration of shul, but everyone's holding at a different level. And for some people, it could be their only connection to Judaism. And we don't say, well, the majority we can sacrifice for that one person. Because if you lose that one person, and because of that one person, all their children and their grandchildren lose their connection, that's in the whole world. Now, majority rules is in court cases when you have judges. It doesn't apply to the cases of, there's a case in the Torah that says that if you have a person that, let's say they say, we want you, let's say murderers come to a town and they say, okay, you've got a choice. We're taking everybody captive. Everyone's captive in your town. We've surrounded the town. You've got a choice. Either you give us the Jews, or you give us two people. You give us one person, and we'll save everybody else. Just give us this one person, and we'll save everybody else. Or we kill you all. What should you do? You know what the Torah says? Ideally, that person goes and gives up themselves. But if that person is not guilty and has done nothing wrong, you have no right to give that person up. You have no right to say that our blood is more precious than their blood. And I would say that this concept applies in the case of the shul as well. You have no right to say, well, our davening is more important than this connection to person's connection to Judaism. Therefore, I would say, but you are 100% correct. I do agree with you that when people are talking in shul, it's against the Torah, it's against halakha, disturbs other people. It has to be done in the correct way. And when in the moment you say this person might have their only connection, the last strong, you have ability to build that person and help them. But by going up to them and saying quiet in shul, that's going to put up their defenses. It could make them feel uncomfortable. So we can politely, you could survive one davening. One davening, you'll survive to the end of davening. At the end of davening, you politely call that person over and you build them up and say, I see that you're a really social guy, and I see that you like to talk to your friend. It's beautiful, and we love you coming to the shul. It's so nice to have you and your family and your kids, etc. And wouldn't be, it would just be so much greater if you could just not talk, etc. I think if it's done in the right way, it will work, and you'll benefit that person, and you'll benefit all the future generations, and you'll also get what you achieved, what you set out to do, as opposed to where you just go shoo, 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 embarrass, make a big commotion, everyone gets angry. And I think that's, getting the great thank yous from everybody else, I don't think is what's going to benefit. But on the other hand, I could tell you, Fritz, that I'm just as guilty as you are, as doing this, as getting annoyed and telling people off and telling people to be quiet. But that's why we're here to learn. So you asked the question. You asked the question as I'm telling you. So I apologize once again if by giving this explanation has made you feel in any way wrong. That's not in my intentions, just to explain what we're discussing.
It just
Yes,
gives
go
me
ahead, Yochanan.
Hi. I was going to ask you, you hear a lot on the news about people being racially abused, say on the public transport or buses or trains. I mean, by right, you should stand up and say something to the person who's giving the abuse. But you could also, at the same time, be putting your own safety at risk. So, how do you overcome the right thing of standing up against racial abuse in public, against putting your own life maybe at risk by being attacked by that very person you're standing up against to? Can you hear me all right?
At the beginning got cut off a bit, but I understood your question.
I've got a very low bandwidth.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Very low bandwidth.
Yeah, I got you at the end. That's a difficult one. I think that I think when you see somebody that's abusing somebody else, It's abuse is, once again, when somebody else's abuse is embarrassment. You know, when they embarrass people, they shame people, they do things wrong. You have an obligation to stand up and protect those people, to stop that. So I wouldn't say that you should be putting your life at risk. If you feel like your life may be at risk by doing that or putting yourself in harm's way, then yeah, then it's best to find out if there's another way to do it that doesn't put you at risk. To perhaps take a picture of the person and contact the police is probably a smarter way than approaching the person outright. And sometimes it's more effective. Yeah, I don't know if always being the warrior, the hero is the smartest and safest way to do things. And I also don't think that it's usually the most productive manner either.
May I add that all public transport, I think in Australia, has an emergency call button in every carriage or conveyance, which starts cameras recording and notifies the driver of such an incident.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah, but at the same time, this could be out on the street too, you know, in the public arena, in the street.
Yeah.
It's always a very difficult situation, of course. But, you know, the government always does tell you these days that you should speak up and and not let these abuses go on.
I think everyone has to, you have to figure out what is your what level of embarrassment of risk you're willing to put yourself up to. I think that if it's putting yourself in risk, you got to be. I think standing up doesn't necessarily mean standing up to that person. It means maybe reporting that person if you can.
Sure.
Okay, let's. We've already gone way over time, and I covered probably about 3/4 of what I wanted to do, which is pretty good. But I want to finish off with.
Sorry, Yohanan, is it worth mentioning the JEAP app? I don't know if you use that as well. JEAP, like to notify CSG of such an incident. Everyone should have the app on their phone.
Yeah, I do have it. Yeah, I've got it. Thanks. Yeah.
Do the other people on this forum know about that?
Yeah, I've got the CSG app. Yeah, for sure. But I was talking outside of that. I mean, I was talking in general public. I wasn't talking about really in the Jewish community. I was just talking out on the street when you hear abuse going on. In that respect, if you should actually speak up and say, this is wrong to the person who's giving the abuse, because I gather that the government encourages people to speak up. That's a new idea.
100%. And we should. I'll just conclude with a few quick thoughts, if that's okay, and then we can continue the conversation, just in case there was anybody who wanted to hear the conclusion. There's a few last thoughts that I want to just say about embarrassment and rebuking. Number one, when it comes to rebuking, I once did a parenting course, or taught a parenting course, did parenting courses. And one thing that you gather is that we sometimes think that it's okay. And I remember that there was like one most important rule that I got out of these things that I taught. And that is, the worst thing that you can do to your child is to embarrass your child. Sometimes people think that it's okay not to embarrass people, but children, it's okay. It's not okay to embarrass anybody, especially children. Children are very impressionable, and often it could last a lifetime, that embarrassment, and can cause great anxiety and damage later on. And that it's done by parents. If you have to tell your child off, and I think I'm probably the only one presently of young kids. Young kids do things wrong all the time. We have to find ways to try to make sure that it's done privately and to the best of our ability, not to, of course, you have to stop them, the misbehavior, whatever it is. But all rebuking has to be done in private, in the most private way. And not only that, if you are doing it in private, also then make sure that it's not being embarrassing. It's never okay to embarrass people. Never, ever okay to embarrass people. as we say, that we started off by saying embarrassment is the equivalent of murder. On the other hand, the Torah tells us for ourselves, what happens when somebody else rebukes us? If we know that we're going to put up the defenses, it says, there's a story of, who was it that said it? Somebody said it, if you have people that praise you and people that rebuke you, you should, if you have friends that praise you and friends that rebuke you, you should keep your distance from those that praise you and come close to those that rebuke you, because the ones that praise you cause you to fail. The ones that rebuke you cause you to rise. Success only comes from learning from mistakes and those that are willing to point out your mistakes. Now, hopefully those people are able to do it in the right way that it's easy for you to accept. But nevertheless, we should all be open to rebuke and know that when we are criticized or told off, and even if it's done in the incorrect way, we should still be willing to accept it for ourselves, because that will only make us stronger. It says, Oyev esatoichacha, love the rebuke. That's what our rabbis. If you're not willing to love and appreciate criticism for ourselves, you cannot really grow.
You can say it in Dutch if you like.
Okay, I'll just conclude with two other last points. One last point is that when we speak about Jews of today that weren't brought up religiously or for whatever reason fell away from the religious path, there's many authorities that talk about this and qualify it, that when we see somebody doing wrong, whether they're driving from shul, whatever, we're not obligated to go and tell them off, because not necessarily are they obligated in the same way as somebody in the old days that was doing something wrong innocently, etc. In other words, today, most Jews don't follow the Torah exactly as it's supposed to be done. And whether it's our obligation to go and stand on the streets and throw stones at cars saying you're doing wrong, according to most authorities would say it's not our job. And not our job, it doesn't work, it's not good, it's not beneficial, not for them, and not necessarily do they even have the same obligation as somebody that would have had this, a couple of centuries ago. So that's an important thing to point out. And my last point before I conclude with a short story is that the concept of rebuke is an understanding that all people work together and we are all responsible for each other. There's a famous statement of Kol Yisrael Arevim Ze Lezeh. We are responsible one for the other. We are the guarantors of each other. And just like if you have one person, we're all in one big boat. And if you have one person on the bottom of the cruise that's just in their own private bedroom, busy making a hole in their bedroom, and it doesn't help, you think it doesn't bother you, it ships the whole boat. Kol Yisrael Arevim means, what does it bother you when you see somebody else doing wrong? It does. And you have an obligation. You say, let that person be, let them be, who cares about them? No. Judaism says, no, you see somebody doing something wrong, you have an obligation to stand up and help them. There's a contrasting concept is that when you see somebody that has doing something wrong, and you know that by rebuking them, it will not help, it will only cause worse, what do we say? You're not allowed to say anything. You shouldn't say anything. So I'll conclude with a story. There's a story of the Yisrael of Viznich, who was known as the Oyev Yisrael, the lover of Israel. He wrote a book called Oyev Yisrael, I think, but he was known as the love of the Jewish people, a tremendous love of the Jewish people. That once he visited the local banker, Jewish man, very wealthy, was not a chassid, but had great respect for the Rebbe. And he was greatly surprised. The Vizhnitzer Rebbe, big Rebbe, is coming to his house. What does he owe the honor? The Rebbe came, he knocked on the door, came and said, oh, welcome in, sure, come inside. The Rebbe comes into his big mansion, sits down, and he says, how can I help you? And he's quiet, he sits there. And after a while, he stands up, gets out, and moves out, and leaves. And the bank manager runs over, Rebbe, you came to my house, surely you wanted something, please tell me. He's like so curious, and what did the Rebbe want? He didn't say anything. And the Rebbe says, no, it's okay. He says, no. If I tell you, you're not going to be able to do it. You're not going to do anything about it in any case. He says, no. He's so curious. He says, no, I promise you, whatever you tell me, I'll do it. So he says, oh, okay. I'll tell you. What happened was, the Torah tells you that when you have something to tell somebody, to rebuke somebody, to tell somebody off, and you know that you're not going to do anything about it, you shouldn't say something to them. So I wanted to fulfill the mitzvah of not rebuking you. So I came to your house, sat in your house, sat in front of you, so I'd have the opportunity to do that mitzvah. So the bank manager says, okay, tell me, what did you want to rebuke me about? He says, no, I can't, because then I'll be fulfilling. He says, Rebbe, I promise. I'll listen to you, whatever you tell me. So he says, okay, I'll tell you. If you said so, I'll tell you. But I'm telling you, I didn't want to do it because I didn't want to rebuke you. Because I knew you weren't going to listen. You're not going to be able to do anything about it. He says, the story is that there's a lady in our community. She's a widower. She has no money. And she owes the bank a huge amount of money. And she's going to be sent out of her home. And she's going to lose her home. She's going to lose everything. And I think that you should take care. You should take care of the situation. He says, Rebbe, you know, what can I do? I'm not in charge of that. I don't own the bank. I'm just the bank manager. I can't cancel the loan. I can't cancel anything. What can I do? He says, you see, I told you I shouldn't have said anything. You can't do anything about it. Sei gesund. I'll see you. I shouldn't have said anything. You can't do anything about it. I shouldn't have. Now I've. And the guy says, you know what, Rebbe, I promised you. He says he goes, he figures out a way. He goes, he takes money out of his own bank account, pays for the lady. The lady goes home, says, oh, Rebbe got exactly what he wanted. He got the mitzvah of not rebuking. He got the mitzvah of rebuking, and he managed in the same process to help the lady as well, all in one shot. So with that, I want to wish you all a wonderful night. Thanks for your patience. I'm going to pause the live stream, say thank you everyone for joining. If anybody wants to stay and ask questions for a few more minutes, you're welcome to. Thank you so much. Have a great night.